There's actually something pretty important that is contributed by this whole series of episodes between John, Mark, and Paul. I think that what they learned can even help us understand bits and pieces of the stuff that they wrote. So I'm going to show you one place in Paul that I think we're helped by this, and another place in Mark. I think Paul learned from the whole episode that you aren't here to control everyone, but to serve Jesus. So if you're a control freak, then you need to calm down and relax. I mean, it isn't like God can't use the strengths that are characteristic of control freaks. But you have to understand that if you're like that, you easily have a propensity to prejudge people, and you might lose out in big ways because of that. He says in 1 Corinthians 11, and this passage always bothered me. It always bothered me until I put it in this context. Paul says this in 1 Corinthians 11, there must be divisions among you so that those who are approved may become evident. Do you see how this passage is actually given a context in the life of Paul? If it wasn't for the division that was created by, be it good or a bad thing, by the conflict between Paul and John Mark, John Mark might never have become the kind of person that he became. And the same thing is true with Paul. Sometimes God just uses bad things in our life to make us better people. He just does that. And sometimes it's other people that we can't seem to get along with. You may know people like that who you think are very abrasive. And you may, at the same time as saying they're abrasive, you may admit that these people are very serious about their service. I think what Mark learned is that you aren't here to like everyone, but to serve Jesus. You really aren't here to like everyone. I don't know if this is relevant, but I heard it said once that we're not told to like everybody, just to love them. I'm not sure if the way that makes sense to me is that sometimes, I don't know if you've noticed this, but sometimes the hardest people to love are God's people. I don't know if you've noticed this or have ever felt this way. I learned this about 20 years ago when I went through a divorce. And I was really offended at the way that I was treated by God's people. And I didn't go to church for about 2 or 3 years after that. It was a tremendous spiritual crisis for me. And it took me a long time to get through it. I was very angry. I had all kinds of stuff going on. I mean, after my wife left, I sat down and I tore up about $5,000 worth of books. I just finished my master's degree, and I blamed my books. I don't know whether I was mad at them or mad at God or what. I just tore them up. I filled 8 garbage bags full of books. Now they're in some landfill in Omaha, Nebraska, probably nurturing some microorganism instead of me. But I didn't go to church for a long time. I'd given up on pursuing what I had been doing. I gave that up. And the hardest thing for me in going back to church was God's people. They were the hardest thing for me. And I would read through 1 John, and I kept hearing God say to me, you know, if you love me, you have to love them. And finally I just resolved that okay, I will. If that is how I prove that I love you, then I will love them. And sometimes it takes more character to love unlovable people than you will ever imagine. I think Mark learned this. I think he was treated pretty bad by Paul. And he had to learn this. That it's not about liking other people, but it's about serving God. We're going to see this demonstrated in one of the miracle stories in Mark's Gospel in a few minutes. I want to start out today by talking about Mark's style. You know, I've told you that Mark was an underestimated person. I think Paul underestimated him. Look at what Mark accomplished in the early church. I think he was really underestimated. You know what else was underestimated? Not just Mark, the person, but his gospel was underestimated. You know that, here's some statistics for you. There is not one commentary written on Mark before the 4th century. Within 10 years of Mark writing his gospel, he had been rewritten twice by Matthew and Luke. In the early lectionary cycles of the church, the lectionary cycles are the annual scriptural readings that the church incorporates into its worship in its sacred calendar year. They have a text that they read for. They borrowed this habit from the synagogue. The synagogue had this. They had lectionary cycles. There are no readings from Mark's gospel in the early lectionary cycles. By far the most popular gospel was Matthew, and next to him was Luke. Mark was considered early on to have been an editor of Matthew, and a pretty poor editor at that. Augustine is the one who said that Mark was an editor of Matthew. In fact, Mark was almost totally ignored by the church until the 19th century. Here's where I might say something good about the historical critics. Do you know what they did for us? They gave us a motivation to read Mark more carefully, because we have been underestimating him for centuries. After the historical critics decided that Mark was the first gospel, they started looking at him a lot closer. And they didn't always see what they were looking for, but you know, that's always the way it happens in science. You always stumble onto things almost by accident in the process of observation and analysis. So we sort of stumbled on to Mark and his literary genius, almost by accident, because of the historical critics. Once they decided that Mark was the first gospel, there was, you wouldn't believe it, there was a flurry, a hurricane of publishing done on Mark beginning in the 19th century. And it hasn't stopped. It hasn't stopped. It's just continued. So he was an underestimated man, and he wrote an underestimated gospel. And I want to show you why he was underestimated. You guys are too young to have kids. But when you have children, and you have a little girl, and she's in kindergarten, and you look forward to the minute when she comes home from kindergarten and you can say, "What did you do today?" You know, and then you're just sort of trying to catch every word that comes out of her mouth about her description of her day. That's how much you will love your child. They'll tell you in the most broken, horrific English about the things that happened to them, but you will relish every word. They'll say things like, and little children at this age use what's called parataxis, and that just means they connect everything with "and." I got to school and Robbie threw up. And then we took a nap. And then the teacher told us a story. And then Johnny got in a fight with Bobby. And you just get a whole string of incidents that are just randomly thrown together, coming from her memory, with a series of and. There's no complex sentence structure in a little child's reconstruction of their day. They don't start out with heretofore, therefore, consequently, because of this, as a result. None of that, okay? Their sentences are just very boom, 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 boom. And we normally think of this kind of sentence structure as maybe sort of what's the word? All right, primitive. Maybe unskilled. Whereas syntax is when sentences are connected with subordinating conjunctions like therefore, because, as a result, complex sentences. Well, in Mark, there's no syntax, just parataxis. Pretty much that's the truth. That's been a comment that we have heard about Mark for centuries and centuries. In fact, it's almost become a proverb. In Mark, there's no syntax, only parataxis. Do you know that the word "and" occurs too many times in Mark's gospel to count, okay? Here's chapter 1. I'll give you chapter 1. 34 out of 45 verses in chapter 1 begin with "and." And the word is the word kai in Greek. Sometimes your translations take some of these "ands" out because, you get tired of saying them. I read normally from the New American Standard Bible, which one of the faults sometimes of the New American Standard Bible is that it's a very wooden translation of the Greek. But for that reason, I like it. I can almost reconstruct the Greek text from the New American Standard English translation. It's not the most beautiful translation, by any means. But 34 out of 45 verses begin with and. 13 out of 16 chapters in Mark's Gospel begin with and. There's another word that Mark really likes. It's the word immediately. Everything happens immediately. And immediately. In Matthew's Gospel, the word immediately occurs 7 times. In Luke, it occurs once. In John, it occurs 3 times. In the rest of the New Testament, it occurs 0. In Mark, it occurs 42 times. Everything happens immediately. Sounds like a little kindergartner telling a story. Yeah. Kai? K-A-I. It's the word and. The word immediately is euthus. I'm going to read to you Mark chapter 1. I want to demonstrate this for you. The beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. As it is written in Isaiah the prophet, "Behold, I send my messenger before your face, who will prepare your way, the voice of one crying in the wilderness, make ready the way of the Lord, make his paths straight." John the Baptist appeared in the wilderness, preaching a baptism of repentance for the forgiveness of sins. And all the country of Judea was going out to him, and all the people of Jerusalem, and they were being baptized by him in the Jordan River, confessing their sins. And John was clothed with camel's hair and wore a leather belt around his waist, and his diet was locusts and wild honey. And he was preaching and saying, "After me comes one who is mightier than I, and I am not even fit to stoop down and untie the thong of his sandal. I baptize you with water, but he will baptize you with the Holy Spirit." And it came about in those days that Jesus came from Nazareth in Galilee, and was baptized by John in the Jordan. And immediately, coming up out of the water, he saw the heavens opening, and the Spirit like a dove descending on him. And a voice came out of the heavens, "Thou art my beloved Son, in thee I am well pleased." And immediately, the Spirit impelled him to go out into the wilderness. And he was in the wilderness 40 days, being tempted by Satan. And he was with the wild beasts, and the angels were ministering to him. And after John had been taken into custody, Jesus came to Galilee, preaching the gospel of God, and saying, "The time is fulfilled, and the kingdom of God is at hand. Repent and believe in the gospel." And as he was going along by the Sea of Galilee, he saw Simon and Andrew, the brother of Simon, casting a net in the sea, for they were fishermen. And Jesus said to them, "Follow me, and I will make you fishers of men." And they immediately left their nets and followed him. And going on a little farther, he saw James the son of Zebedee and John his brother, who were in the boat mending the nets. And immediately he called them. And they left their father Zebedee in the boat with the hired servants and went away to follow him. And they went into Capernaum, and immediately on the Sabbath he entered the synagogue and began to teach. And they were amazed at his teaching, for he was teaching them as one having authority, and not as the scribes. And just then there was in the synagogue a man with an unclean spirit, and he cried out, saying, "What do we have to do with you, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." And Jesus rebuked him, saying, "Be quiet, and come out of him." And throwing him into convulsions, the unclean spirit cried out with a loud voice and came out of him. And they were all amazed. So they debated among themselves, saying, "What is this? A new teaching with authority. He commands even unclean spirits, and they obey him." And immediately the news about him went out everywhere into all the surrounding district of Galilee. And immediately, after they had come out of the synagogue, they came into the house of Simon and Andrew with James and John. Now Simon's mother-in-law was lying sick with a fever, and immediately they spoke to him about her. And he came to her and raised her up, taking her by the hand. And the fever left her, and she began to wait on them. And when evening had come, after the sun had set, they began bringing to him all who were ill and who were demon-possessed, and the whole city had gathered at the door. And he healed many who were ill with various diseases, and cast out many demons. And he was not permitting the demons to speak because they knew who he was. And in the early morning, and. Have I read enough? You guys bored? Yeah. You know what? I didn't bore you. Mark did. He bored a lot of people. Matthew and Luke changed a lot of things in Mark. For one thing, they took a lot of the immediatelys out. They also took a lot of the ends out. And. What we learned in the 19th and 20th centuries after studying Mark more carefully is that there is a different style here that is a little bit different kind of narrative. It isn't a narrative that builds necessarily to a climax. It's a narrative that places episodes beside each other. And what Mark intends to happen during these episodes placed beside one another is he wants, for example, one episode to suggest an interpretation of the other. We didn't really know this until we started looking at Mark more closely. I showed you earlier the passage, I think it was in the course pack. Remember the trial of Jesus? How Mark put the trial of Jesus next to the trial of Peter? It's on page 53 in the course pack. We looked at this a couple weeks ago, I think. This is a great example of his episodic style. We've got two trials here, the trial of Jesus, the trial of Peter. And one of these trials reveals things about the other one, and vice versa. And in telling the story of Jesus' trial and Peter's trial this way, a lot of things are contributed to the narrative for you, the reader. And that's another important thing that they figured out. That what's really important in Mark is this triangle. We've got the author right here. We've got the characters in the story. But Mark is doing something very consciously. He's very aware of something, and that is, he's very aware of your presence. So they begin to think that maybe the writer was writing the story almost holding the reader as one of the three principal points of the triangle. So over here, we've got the reader. And here's the story. Mark takes the story and the characters and the reader, you, and frequently he holds these in tension with one another. For example, you learn at the very beginning of the story when Mark says the gospel, or the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Verse 1, he tells you, the reader, who Jesus is. You know before the story begins. You know that the readers in the story never figure that out. So he's holding you in tension with the characters in the story. They're experiencing Jesus and aren't quite able to come to a sound conclusion about him. While you, the reader, are watching the story unfold, and you know right away who he is. He told you at the very first verse. Finally, at the end of the story, you get a confession from the centurion at the foot of the cross. Surely this man was the Son of God. Finally, we get a human being saying that was said at the very beginning. This beginning and ending of the story with Son of God is an inclusio. An inclusio is a storytelling technique used by good storytellers, especially good storytellers in antiquity. It's actually, an inclusio means that they begin and they will frame a section of a story with two similar events or statements. And that means that that whole series of episodes is supposed to be read together, contextually. We have the whole Gospel of Mark is one huge inclusio. But we have other inclusios in Mark. I mean, he does this in other places. Mark isn't the only gospel writer that does this, by the way, the use of inclusios. But this is a great one. And it's an example of how he holds the reader and the characters in tension with one another. They're experiencing Jesus in a different way than you are. Because the stuff they're asking themselves, you know the answer to. When they're in the boat in chapter 4, saying, "Who is this that even the wind and the sea obey him?" You know the answer to that. You know. They don't. You're on another level than the characters in the story. And so, part of your perception of everything is determined by things you know that they don't know. This is a dynamic. This is a rhetorical dynamic, narrative dynamic that Mark plays with all the time. In fact, we see him play with this so skillfully that you almost have to say, you know what, when we said that he was primitive and that all of his parataxis was sort of poor storytelling, we were completely wrong. He was very much in control. We just didn't have eyes to see it. So he's been underestimated. One of the things, if I were to sort of list the theological motifs of Mark, the things that he develops in kind of a systematic way, one of them would be this. It isn't the name you have, but the name you serve. And, you know, if you think about this, in light of John Mark's story, this seems to be something that he experienced in his life. Because in the early church, his name was Mud. He was called a deserter. He was kind of he had no control over the way that the episode that he had with Paul was going to be told. He had no control over it. Yeah, in that sense, he had no control over the kind of reputation that was developing. And one of the things he had to learn was that it isn't the name you have, but the name you serve. If you look through Mark's gospel, it's an interesting thing. Everybody with a name is a nobody. Everybody that's nameless is somebody. He tells the story this way. Everybody that has a name let me put it another way. If you're reading Mark's gospel, if you meet somebody that is actually given a name, don't act like they do. They are not the model of the ideal disciple. Okay? So the real disciples in Mark are the nameless ones. I think this is Mark's way of developing that saying of Jesus, the first shall be last, and the last shall be first. When the disciples came to him, came to Jesus, and they said, we want to know who's going to sit next to you in the kingdom. You know, what's going to be the pecking order? And Jesus just kind of threw up his hands and said, you guys are completely wrong about this. Service in the kingdom of God determines greatness. Service. In fact, the greatest people in the kingdom are probably people you don't know and never heard of. Because they don't care about their reputation, about their name. So in Mark's gospel, it just sort of is a truism. If you have a name, you're nobody. If you don't have a name, watch those people. And it really does work out that way. The disciples, the 12 disciples, in Mark's gospel, they are the most ignorant, bumbling, error-prone people you can meet. They seem to have blinders on. They just can't see anything clearly, even though they experience it over and over again. One of the motifs in the Gospel of Mark is the stupidity of the 12. And if you meet people that do seem to understand or comprehend something about Jesus, they're never given a name. Anyway. I want to show you probably the most important inclusio in Mark's gospel. It's called the central section. Scholars, anybody who has read the gospel, has long known that this central section was sort of the mother lode of Mark's gospel. That's where the substantive information is given. It starts in 8:27. And it goes to 10:45. This central section is framed by two stories that are very much similar to one another. They're both sight restoration miracles. If you have your course pack, why don't you turn it to page 56. This episode right here, I've called the two-try miracle. It's the miracle, it's the only miracle it's the only miracle that's obvious to us in Mark that has failed. It takes Jesus 2 tries to restore this guy's sight. Now, I told you that I had a theory about the significance of this story in Mark. By the way, Matthew and Luke both leave this story out. And if you were using Mark, you probably would too. Because it doesn't have a lot of value if your objective is to portray Jesus as a potent miracle worker. Let me read it. They came to Bethsaida. Some people brought a blind man to him and begged him to touch him. He took the blind man by the hand and led him out of the village, and when he had put saliva on his eyes and laid hands on him, he asked him, "Can you see anything?" The man looked up and said, "I can see people, but they look like trees walking." Then Jesus laid his hands on his eyes again, and he looked intently, and his sight was restored. Then he saw everything clearly. He sent him away then to his home, saying, "Do not even go into the village." The last miracle is chapter 10, verses 46 through 52. And by the way, this is the last miracle in Mark. Except for the cursing of the fig tree, which is a different kind of thing. It's the last miracle. It's the last miracle. You know, all of Mark's miracles occur in the first half of the gospel. You get to this point, and they just stop. Then you have the central section, the central theological section. Then you have this miracle, which seems to have worked, and it's the last miracle. This is the story of blind Bartimaeus. Now, it's what happens in between these two miracles that's really interesting. Because in between here, you have, on page 57 of your course pack, you have 3 predictions by Jesus of his passion. He does it 3 times. Prediction number 1, number 2, and number 3. This one occurs chapter 8, verse 27 through 9:1. This one is 9, verse 30 through 37. This one is 10, 32 through 45. This represents 3 episodes in Mark. And each one has a very consistent pattern. This is very important. If you have your course pack out, you can see that I have these listed. Each one begins with a geographical reference. After the geographical reference, you have the prediction. After the prediction, you have the characteristic, and you've come to expect this, the misunderstanding from the disciples. This characteristic misunderstanding is the foil that provides Jesus with an opportunity to explain to them what true discipleship is. And so, on the heels of their misunderstanding comes teaching. Of course, the most important part of this are these: the prediction, and the teaching. Listen to what Jesus says about discipleship. If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow me. Those who want to save their life will lose it. Those who lose their life for my sake will save it. What will it profit them to gain the whole world and forfeit their life? What can they give in return for their life? Those who are ashamed of me and of my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of them the Son of Man will be ashamed when he comes in the glory of his Father. That's the first teaching. Here's the second one. Then they came to Capernaum, and when he was in the house, he asked them, "What were you arguing about on the road?" But they were silent, for on the way they had been arguing with one another who was the greatest. He sat down, called the 12, and said to them, "Whoever wants to be first must be last, and the servant of all." Then he took a little child, and he put it among them, and he took it in his arms, and he said to them, "Whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me." Here's the third teaching. The sons of Zebedee had asked that they be able to sit one at his right hand and one at his left in glory. And he said to them, You do not know what you are asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I drink, or be baptized with the baptism that I am baptized with? He says in verse 42, "You know that among the Gentiles, those whom they recognize as their rulers lord it over them, and their great ones are tyrants. But it is not so among you. Whoever wishes to become great among you must be your servant. Whoever wishes to be first among you must be the slave of all." So there's the paradigm for discipleship in the Gospel of John, or the Gospel of Mark. Service, sacrifice, humility. Jesus was trying to get his disciples to live like him, to follow him on the road to the cross. There's only one thing that he promised his disciples in Mark. He didn't promise them new cars. He didn't promise them wealth, comfort, What did he promise? Yeah. That's all he promises. That's not very seeker friendly, is it? I had a friend in college who came up to me one day and he said he'd been listening to this preacher, and this preacher was, you guys have met people that treated God like a sugar daddy? You know, God will give you whatever you want, you know. Just tell him what you want, he'll give it to you. Well, he'd been listening to one of these guys, and he said, I really think that this is right. And I said, well, Raymond, what are you going to do? And he said, I want a new car. And I thought, oh, great, here we go. So a few weeks later, Raymond comes up to me and he says, I got my new car. And I thought, whoa, cool. Kind of surprised me. So I asked him, you know, how he got it. And he said, well, you know, he was a college student, had no money, he was poor like you. And so I asked him how he did it, because he tried to get a loan. He couldn't get anybody to loan him money. So I said, how did you get the money? And he said, well, I went and borrowed it from my dad. And I said, Raymond, are you trying to tell me that you went to borrow money from your dad to buy a new car, and you think this is God answering your prayer? Newsflash, guys. Newsflash. Here's what you will get for following Jesus faithfully. Persecution, suffering. That's what you'll get. If that's not what you want, then pick a different road. Really. This is the essence of discipleship, right here. It's in the mother lode. You know, what's interesting is Jesus, in Gospel of Mark, Jesus sort of takes two different stabs at getting disciples. The first stab is to heal everybody. And he gets swarms of people. I mean, he gets swarmed by people. But the perception and the commitment and the faithfulness of these people is substandard, if there at all. In other words, it wasn't a very fruitful effort. The first 8 chapters, I mean, in these first 8 chapters, Jesus can do anything. I mean, he's like Superboy, Superman. There's nothing he can't do. He can rope the moon and bring it down. There is not a thing he can't do in these first 8 chapters. Then the whole thing ends, boom, right here, with this failed miracle. The next thing you have is a completely different stab at discipleship. This time, it's like this. I'm going to die. The disciples say, no, 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 you can't do that. Misunderstanding. Then he says, and I want you to die too. I'm here to serve. I want you to serve too. I didn't come here to gloat and to grab glory. I came here to serve selflessly. If you want to follow me, then that's the road I'm on. This road ends in Jerusalem on a cross. Then, after these 3 predictions and episodes, we get another miracle. Now, this one is really worth looking at. Do you know why? Because this one works. Let me read it to you. They came to Jericho. As he and his disciples and a large crowd were leaving Jericho, Bartimaeus, which means son of Timaeus, a blind beggar, was sitting by the roadside. When he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to shout out and say, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." Many sternly ordered him to be quiet, but he cried out even more loudly, "Son of David, have mercy on me." Jesus stood still and said, "Call him here." They called the blind man and said to him, "Take heart, get up, he's calling you." So throwing off his cloak, he sprang up and came to Jesus. Then Jesus said to him, "Now wouldn't you like to hear Jesus say this to you? What can I do for you today?" Wouldn't you love to hear that? Sometimes I get up in the morning and I just read this passage because I want to hear those words. What can I do for you? So I tell him. Do you ever do that? Do you ever have a list of things that you would really like him to help you with? Do you ever just give it to him? Anyway, he says this, "What can I do for you?" The blind man said, now you can guess what he said, right? He's blind. He says, "I want to see." Duh. I want to run the 100-yard dash in 10 flat. No. I want to see. I want to see stuff again. "My teacher, let me see again." Jesus said to him, "Go. Your faith has made you well." Now look at these. Look at what happens right here. Immediately he regained his sight and he followed him on the way. Now I just don't like this translation. You know why? Because what Bartimaeus does is he sees, quote unquote, sees, and then he follows him on the, quote unquote, the road. The road. The road to Jerusalem. He follows him on the road. Finally, we meet a disciple who wants to follow him on the road. This is a miracle story that really worked. This guy didn't just get his sight back. He got his sight back. And lest you think that this is an exception to this rule, that if you have a name, you're a nobody, let me tell you what Bartimaeus really means. It means son of uncleanness. Dirtbag. What's his name? Dirtbag. You don't believe me? I didn't think I would. I gave you a note on Bartimaeus on page 59. Bartimaeus is not a true name. Once again, we're being treated here to a clever double entendre. The first part of the name, Bar, means son of. One might suppose that the second part is his father's name, Timaeus. However, the derivation of the Semitic word has two possibilities. Either it is from tam, which means purge or make clean, or it is from tama'ah, which means uncleanness, either sexual or spiritual. Both of the above words appear in Ezekiel 22:15. "I will scatter you among the nations and disperse you through the countries, and I will purge your filthiness out of you." So who's the ideal disciple in Mark's gospel? The one who is healed and follows him on the road. It's dirtbag. That's who you want to be like. One of the problems with this interpretation of this central section like this is that it seems to say something negative about miracles. And I'm a little bit uncomfortable with that, just because I know that miracles are an effective tool used by God. But you can think of this in another way also. You can think of how effective a welfare system is at producing people who become good disciples. See, I don't think that Jesus necessarily gives everything away. I think he just requires a lot of us. His approach to discipleship in this central section is very demanding. Very demanding. Do you guys have any questions? 'Cause that's about all I want to do today. Good. Thanks for your papers. Have a nice long week. I'll see you next Thursday.